Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here and talk about what I think is an enormous problem that is confronting every liberal democracy, which is the concentration of power in the hands of not only big tech, but monopolies across our political economies. So my name is Matt Stoller, and I just finished a book called Goliath on the history of monopoly power, and I am here to give you an overview of the American reformer perspective on big tech. So here's the problem in a nutshell. A few years ago, Mark Zuckerberg said the following, quote, "In a lot of ways, Facebook is more like a government than a traditional company. We have this large community of people, and more than other technology companies, we're really setting policies." Zuckerberg is trying to establish a global court for content moderation. He is now structuring explicitly the media environment with a quasi-cartel of publishers, and he is even trying to create his own currency. Such concentrations of power, private unaccountable power, are simply not compatible with democracy. And I want to make one other quote, which came from a speaker earlier today, Yu Hong, who said about the Chinese big tech companies that the fundamental imperatives are the same for those companies as for Facebook, Google, Amazon. So what I'm here to deliver a fairly simple message, which is we do not have to pick, and I say we because I mean liberal democracies. We do not have to pick between Chinese autocracy and the autocracy of Mark Zuckerberg. That is a false choice. Yeah, you can clap. It's true. And let's be clear what these companies do, how they make money. They sell advertising. And if you do things to their business models to preserve democracy, what we will get is slightly less relevant advertising. That's the cost of saving democracy. Is that a trade-off that we want to make? Because it's a trade-off I think we should make. Yeah. All right. I didn't even say anything mean about Donald Trump. Okay, so how are Americans reacting to the debate over big tech, to this unaccountable accumulation of power? Well, it's pretty simple. We are changing our minds. 2/3 of Americans believe Facebook and Google should be subjected to an antitrust investigation. Last April of 2018, Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress, and the tech press widely mocked the politicians who were asking him questions. They don't know anything about technology. It's a joke. A couple of weeks ago, he testified again, and the tech press had a very different frame. They said that beyond the verbal thrashing, members of the Financial Services Committee have some genuinely relevant inquiries. Unlike Zuckerberg's first congressional appearance, especially in the House, a lot of his interlocutors seem to have done considerable homework, and they raise issues that credibly challenge some of Facebook's pronouncements about Libra. That comes from Wired magazine. Wired magazine is a sycophant to big tech, and they were criticizing Mark Zuckerberg's appearance before Congress, complimenting American politicians in Congress. That's a really big deal. So what happened? And what are the different proposals for reform of big tech? Well, the short story is an ideological collapse of the prevailing neoliberal framework that has guided policy for 40 years. Now, a lot of people think American capitalism means inequality and this dynamism in the private sector, these monopolies. I don't really have time to go into it. That is a complete false myth. It was invented in the 1950s by a few American academics on the left. American capitalism from the 1790s until the 1970s tended to mean equality, and Americans used to contrast their system of capitalism and open markets with the inequality of European aristocracies and monarchies. But that changed in the 1970s. And since the 70s, policymakers have encouraged mergers, concentration, and corporatism. The number of public companies in America has dropped by half since the 1990s, and they did this under the guise that big business is good for consumers. And today, in both the US and in Europe, the goal of consumer welfare is what our competition policy aims to achieve. And after all, if you're thinking about consumer welfare in terms of the money you pay, Google and Facebook are free. So what's the problem? Google, Facebook, and Amazon are pace setters of a new monopoly-dominated economy that has emerged since the 1970s. And we tend to think of these companies as innovative, as tech companies who started in garages. But it's not really accurate. These are financial holding companies built through mergers and legal changes. So from 2004 to 2014, Google spent $23 billion or more buying 145 companies, including the advertising giant DoubleClick. Facebook has spent a similar amount buying 66 companies, including key acquisitions allowing it to attain dominance in mobile social networking. Not a single one of these mergers was blocked, despite anti-merger laws in both the US and in Europe. Allowing these mergers was policy. Similarly, the absence of public rules on structuring the use of data, such as the failure of Do Not Track, this is more about America than Europe, but it's pretty bad here too. It enabled a particular regulatory regime based on concentrating the flow of information, advertising, and data. So these financial holding companies are dominant. Google has 8 products with more than 1 billion users: search, browsers, maps, online video, mobile phone operating systems. Now, people like to talk about economies of scale, networks effects, and so on and so forth. There's nothing that you need, there's no scaling economies in terms of having search and YouTube. Those are just separate divisions, right? So a lot of this stuff is just myth that people tell because they're selling something. Now, basically what these companies do is they also have, this is what you don't see, they have control over the plumbing of the online advertising system, and they structure the rules of advertising. And they do so to encourage data leakage, invasive surveillance, and addiction. To protect privacy and to protect democracy demands addressing the problem at the source, which is the monopolistic models enabled by our current legal framework. Now, I could go into how these guys are killing the free press. They are. How they are addicting and spreading misinformation. They are. How it's coming now from China, TikTok, which now is controlled effectively by the CCP. But the crisis has been evident for years. What changed to prompt a political response? There were basically 3 events. First, there was the financial crisis. And all of a sudden, everyone realized banks and corporations are not neutral and scientific. They don't deliver consumer welfare. They are political institutions. Second, there was the election of Donald Trump. So for a time, big tech avoided the skepticism that most of us felt towards Wall Street. Obama administration officials thought that if you go to work for Wall Street, that's a little bit sleazy. But if you go to work for Facebook and Google, that's progressive. But when Donald Trump was elected, it turns out that these are just advertising companies. And the third is Cambridge Analytica. The scandal that showed that these corporations are political actors, first and foremost, no different than the banks that crashed the economy. So now the ideological crack-up is happening in the business community too. 50% of CEOs, Fortune 500 CEOs, believe that Facebook should be regulated. There's a bunch of billionaires who are calling for these companies to be broken up. So what does all this mean? Well, it's kind of hard to tell what the immediate policy impacts are. Donald Trump and his administration are, let's just say, not consistent in their policy goals. But Congress is more serious, and the change that's happening, I think, among the American people and all over the world is real. So Congress is investigating the tech platforms through the House Antitrust Subcommittee led by David Cicilline. He has joined the International Committee of Parliamentarians. Competitors are giving information to his committee. I think they're very serious. They're going to come out with a report next year. Every state has an attorney general, a law enforcer, and 50 of them are now investigating Google. And they have said, the lead, who's a conservative Texas Republican, said that breaking up Google is on the table. California passed a privacy law sort of modeled on the GDPR. Elizabeth Warren has suggested splitting up tech platforms, and all Democrats are now expressing skepticism towards big tech and talking about antitrust, and this is causing the federal enforcers to play catch-up. So what are the proposals on the table? Well, I'm going to give you 3 philosophies. The first is to continue the neoliberal underpinning of our culture and allow private governments in the form of Facebook, Google, TikTok, big tech. That's what Mark Zuckerberg wants. It's also what you see when civil rights group or conservative groups ask these guys to censor content in the way that they prefer. Much of the antitrust establishment here and in the U.S. is basically fine. They maybe want a few tweaks, but they're basically fine with these guys being in control. They want privacy rules, but rules that don't really hinder Google and Facebook to structure the internet how they want. The second philosophy is the national champion framework. This framework is organized around the concept of regulated monopoly. So national security experts want to protect big tech because they perceive American corporations as essential to blocking Chinese competition. I go into that, but basically it's coming from a few national security people. Brad Smith of Microsoft is talking about how he's appointed a team of Microsoft diplomats who work with policymakers and industry partners around the world to advance trust and security on the internet. And he talks about how companies are now involved in a new generation of humanitarian and arms limitation issues. Private government, but nice. Okay, data regulation makes sense in this case, but this regulation must not hinder the ability of the fused corporate and governing state to wield power. There's a sort of deal here where mass commercial surveillance by large entities is useful for national security ends, but it must be kept within bounds. Now, this national champion idea is extremely dangerous because it is about concentrating power and putting it in the hands of the state. I hear a lot about European champions here. You should be very careful about whether you concentrate power and how you choose to concentrate power. Yeah. Now, the third philosophy is the tradition that I come from, which is regulated competition, or decentralizing political power by breaking up monopolies and regulating the business practices in the resulting markets. So Elizabeth Warren seeks to just break up big tech and then also use public utility rules to make sure that there are no conflicts of interest in the business model going forward. The intellectual forebearer of this model is Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. Brandeis's view was that democracy and unregulated monopoly are simply incompatible. George Soros made this point at Davos a few years ago, saying that there could be a, quote, alliance between authoritarian states and these large data-rich IT monopolies that would bring together nascent systems of corporate surveillance with an already developed system of state-sponsored surveillance. This may well result in a web of totalitarian control, the likes of which not even Aldous Huxley or George Orwell could have imagined. Now, I'll just say a little bit about history here. It was in 1944, and this is just, we invented a fake history in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. We made the story that policymakers created this era of prosperity based on consumerism and growth. And that is not true. They based their policy on decentralizing commercial power and controlling big finance because they had gone through 2 world wars. That's what it was about. It was about preventing autocracy through our financial system and preventing world war. And we stopped doing that in the 1970s. And because of that, we are in a real crisis. And it's not just big tech that's the crisis, but they are the pace setters. But it's important to understand that the history that we know of how our democracies got to where they are is largely, not entirely, but largely about writing political economy out of the equation. But the real answer to addressing the power of Google and Facebook is simple. If something is too big, make it smaller. So Google's 8 products with more than 1 billion users. I don't know why they have to all be in the same corporation. Break apart Facebook. You can impose interoperability mandates. There's a lot of really good work here on data. I'm excited to learn more about that. Impose vertical restraints so that we can maintain the benefits of scale, but eliminate the inappropriate political power of Mark Zuckerberg and the rest of the big tech. In this schema, regulating the use of data is not about protecting privacy per se, though it can be that as well, but it's about preventing coercion and manipulation, price discrimination, theft. Fundamentally, the question that Zuckerberg or institutions like Google or TikTok present to liberal democracies is critical. Can we muster the will to govern ourselves? Or will we allow ourselves to be distracted or frightened into submission? Every generation gets its chance to answer these questions, but the questions always look different. In our case, those who seek to put us all into servitude. They look like Google, or maybe they look like European champions or national champions or American national champions or Chinese national champions. But though their power can seem overwhelming, and though they can present a whole bunch of false choices to us, we have the honor of living in democracies, and we do not have to submit to them. Thank you.